Thanks very much, Mark. And let me also say how delighted I am here to be in Oxford, not because of Oxford, to be frank, but because of Silent, and because, of course, to see how TMD has evolved over these years, which I think is really impressive, and I think you should really be congratulated on what you have achieved here and to bring all these scholars here together in our community, in the sense of broadening that community very much to assess, which I think, and I follow absolutely what Callistus was saying, by broadening that community to include the business community, and in particular the entrepreneurship and management issue. I think this is the novelty. This is really where I will not talk about, because I'm not an expert on this issue, but I'm sure that Yves and many others will be talking much more about this later. When I saw the title of this conference, it reminds me, of course, as much more somebody who has worked in the developed world, it reminded me very much about the Lisbon strategy in Europe, which, just to remind you, was a moment of European, whatever, hype, European beliefs, and at what time one put forward a strategy to say that Europe would be the core center with respect to achieving technological competitiveness in terms of leading the world at the level of renewal in technologies, while at the same time focusing on social inclusion. This was the whole idea, that there were ministers of employment and ministers of industry and technology and innovation put together, and all this afterwards in Gothenburg, to which one added the sustainability element. And so the Lisbon strategy is basically what we're discussing here today, but then within a framework of low-income countries. So I would say good luck if you see what happened to the Lisbon strategy and what was coming out of this, and you can see that the difficulties indeed of the trade-offs between each of these areas, you can see that this is a very tough one, and you can indeed call that you will grow on the basis of green technologies, or you will grow on the basis of social inclusion. Well, again, these are quite fundamental and pretty tough policy decisions to be made. So I couldn't resist to start a little bit with saying this. And I think from this perspective, it's really the opposite today. We probably could learn from you, from what happens in Africa, in low-income countries. We probably could learn in Europe how to address those and not to allow one of those policy aims to start to dominate, as it happened, for instance, in Europe. You could say in Europe, nobody, I think, talked about the social achievements over the last couple of years. It was basically, if today we are in a Euro crisis, we talk very much more about possible structural changes dealing possibly with technology, with research, but very little actually with anything about social inclusion or even with sustainability. My focus on my talk will be very much a little bit in the lines of what Callistus mentioned, possibly less referring to Schumpeter, but more in a general sense. I think there is a very big shift which occurred and which has a lot to do with information and communication technologies, with digital technologies, and the way we have started to focus on innovation in a different way from what we did when focusing on industrial research and development. I'll then start to criticize Schumpeter, and not Schumpeter, but criticize the innovation studies community, and I come then up with a couple of implications with respect to the new innovation development. And as I'm here in Oxford, I thought I could use the Anfield Road one-liner, you never walk alone, you never innovate alone, as the big paradigm issue, which is really a global innovation paradigm. So the first thing is really research as we knew it, and I still think that we should put this back in the historical context. I think the focus on industrial research and development, on large industries, on the way innovation was very much linked to technologies has, of course, a lot to do with the focus on the way technical progress was very much something which was linked to the typical shops we had, the sort of workshops we had, and the way Chris Freeman and others have described this as it existed already in the 18th century and the 19th century, was really where industrial research and development laboratories were to some extent an expression of specialization. One was grouping these activities in laboratories, and to some extent what you had is that It's a professionalization, so to say, because this interaction between science and technology driven in the sort of, you remember the Stokes quadrants, driven to some extent by problem solving, needing more scientific basis was really the base in which these industrial research labs were set up. David Mowry, many other people have described how this occurred in the US, how this started with areas such as chemistry, how it was evolved, and it evolved in many other sectors, how new sectors like engineering, industrial engineering, but also electrical engineering, electronic engineering, chemical engineering, all appeared about the difficulty of what you had invented in these research labs, how to scale this up in terms of industrial production. And that required a lot of trial and error. You needed new engineering fields to be developed, and many of you sitting actually here have described this, have written about this, have studied this, whether this is about agricultural engineering, or it's even, you could say today, about bioengineering, which has similar problems in terms of scaling up of the invention as carried out in the industrial or in the research lab of whatever firm or organization. And what typically Joe Mokyr has called tight science and technology is indeed this link where modern industrial R&D was really the basis on which cleaning up, so to say, in establishing clear scientific principles with respect to the research progress and in particular technological progress. And remember, you see this very much today. We have still a couple of very complex products. Remember the shuttle, and where we will have failures, and you will have failures in the technology itself, but you can clearly see that in terms of what is expected in terms of failures, the technology itself is much more reliable. We are dealing with some areas where complexities are, of course, formidable one, but these are becoming to some extent the areas where in terms primarily, I will come back to that in terms of sustainability and in terms of high risks and scientific uncertainties where we still confront major issues, but the tightness of science and technology in these areas is what is characteristic. And so this is to some extent where you had the logic then of a ranking of industries, high-tech industries with high research and development efforts, with strong scientific basis, and low-tech industries where you had much more design, crafts, and various other areas being important. I think that this was also the basis of industrial technology policies, whereby really in countries, and you see this very much, of course, in the US, you see this very much in Japan, you see this also in European countries, and later on in Brazil, in emerging countries, this focus on industrial technology policies is very much justified in terms of saying, well, we have to increase either the R&D expenditures within these high-tech sectors to keep them up in terms of world productivity levels. Alternatively, we have to shift our industrial structure in the direction of these high-tech industries. And you see continuous these double concerns. Remember also again in Europe the discussions, the shift from the Rust Belt industries and the whole way in which industrial adjustment, for those of you who remember these discussions in the 60s and the 70s, how that discussion moved from Dust Belt industries to sunrise industries, which was really the novelty which was introduced in the 70s in Europe, which was the basis for the framework programs, the whole issue about how we focus on these high-tech industries. And you could say to some extent that where Europe was successful in the coal, steel, and mining and cleaning up the industrial adjustment, it failed completely on the other sunrise industries. I leave that. I'm not here to start to do my Euro bashing. We'll do this on another time. But I think it's important that, and this follows very much to what Kalestis was mentioning, that you had a huge emergence of new characteristics of innovation. And I would still identify those very much with this fundamental challenge of information and communication technology. This is really, for me, is a disruption in this industrial R&D science and technology development. And clearly you see this if you focus very much in the way industrial research labs operated before. And clearly there, Dick Nelson has written a lot about this. You had very clearly how the procedures of what was occurring within an industrial lab would then be imitated in reality with all the problems and the tryouts, the pilot plans, the scaling up, the way, as I write here, as Dick Nelson put it, the ability to hold in place what you had done within the lab now at the scale of 1,000 more in terms of size. How could you keep that in place in industrial production? And that raised tremendous issues in terms of the way you set up, how you organized your plants, all these sort of activities. This was typically what many people, also in our community, have been talking about in terms of the cumulative nature, the technological paradigms, the way in which technology proceeded slowly with now and then a disruption. But clearly, this kind of vision about how progress could be determined in terms of these industrial progresses was really characteristic of what I would call industrial R&D. And again, you can see Chris Freeman, Keith Pavitt, many others here in the UK, in Sussex, but also here in Oxford, who have written a lot about this in terms of describing this. And of course, this is still what you find in many manufacturing sectors, where in automobile sector, consumer electronics, chemicals, the tightness is of course still there with the science and technology basis, but here and there the complexity becomes such that it's very difficult, that it is sometimes you have failures, but they're failures not in the mechanics, they're typically failures, I come to that, in the software, in these areas which add features where the behavioral elements become essential. And that's, of course, the new, what I call new, well, we call everything, of course, new. I've been talking about new since the last 20 years, so this is a repeat of new. But you could say that new in the sense of putting very different conditions in terms of what is progress here. In other words, with these new technologies linked to information and technologies, you suddenly are in areas which are very different. Service areas, you deal with areas where you have difficulties in terms of reproduction, because the whole exercise is very much one which is context specific, which is time specific, which is specific to the audience, to the interaction you have with your users or your consumers. And in other words, you have a sort of research which becomes much more of a trial and error type. And that trial and error type means that you can ex post observe how the improvements were there, but it's very difficult to say ex ante what were now the essential conditions in terms of making this a successful innovation or a failure. And so what you get is a sort of process in which new features become essential. Entrepreneurship, the leadership point which Calestus made. The users, can you think again from Eric van Hippel, how you can introduce how users might react to these particular technologies, their role becomes much more essential. So you see all kinds of features which obviously existed there in industrial R&D, but which suddenly have a much stronger importance in making a successful breakthrough or innovation in those areas. So this is really an area where codified parts can easily be imitated, but the other parts, imitation is basically never complete. You suddenly have issues which suddenly appeared ex post extremely important, but in other cases were not important. So it's very difficult to establish a vision on there. And this is really where innovation studies come in. We have a large area of innovation studies there, which typically were studies done at the level of these cases to identify which were the factors successful and which were failures. But to some extent, if you look at the theory of innovation, we have not a theory, we have basically, and despite Schumpeter, maybe this was Schumpeter's most important contribution, at least the young Schumpeter in the theory of economic development, which is positivism. And I think this is really a problem. Because this is really where I would say, and as I put it here, like the old Guinness advert, we could say innovation is good for you. And I don't know a policy maker, an international or national policy maker, who would say that innovation is not good for you. But exactly like Guinness decided to cancel its advert, despite the fact that it actually is true, a pint of Guinness a day is actually good for you, because as I wrote here, Guinness contains antioxidants like those found in red wine and dark chocolate. But Guinness, wisely as it was, decided to cancel that campaign because it didn't want to be considered a health company. And I would say that we innovation scholars should do the same thing. We're not there to be health economists or economists who have a positive support for policymakers. If we don't, we will run the risk to be moved away once the hype of innovation studies is gone. And why I'm saying this is that because, of course, if you look at the innovation evidence, and I come back to my previous point, innovation failure is, of course, the rule. And this goes back to the studies at Sussex with the SAFER project, Success and Failure in Innovations, which were studies on case studies, and where basically one could learn much more out of the failure than out of the successes. Because exactly as I mentioned before, the successes could not be identified with variables which would be significant across the board. They were each time very different. So actually one could learn much more out of failure because one could identify variables which were common to all these cases. We also know that in terms of technology case studies, and back to the works of Brian Arthur and Paul David, we know that technological locking in is again a systemic failure, which is very much identified with the progress nature of some of those technologies and the way we get stuck in particular technologies, and we fail to get out of it because of the increasing returns, the very systemic links. And similarly, we know also at the levels of many areas, I refer here, for instance, to the debate which Yves and myself were attending at ALPAC, where basically you have continuously the debates about technology policy, and where we know that between diffusion policies, knowledge transfer policies, policies in terms of focusing on research excellence, we have continuously differences, etc. And this was a debate with Helga Novotny, Konstantin Novoselov here from Manchester, the Nobel Prize winner 2010, Edward Assel from Imperial College, Nicole Gobert here from Oxford, debating about what were the issues in terms of research excellence. And at the macro level, well, again, I only have to refer to Chris Freeman and all the work of Schumpeter in his long cycles to show that unemployment, creative destruction accompanied, of course, very much new innovations, and that there have been many social implications of displacement, destroying skills, destroying jobs, etc. So again, the positivism as associated with innovation is not something which is justified by any means in terms of the empirical research. So what I really wanted to discuss very briefly here is this idea that, and Mark hinted already at this, is the idea that as Schumpeter talked about creative destruction, because he was interested in long-term development, as he always insisted on, and we could argue that creative destruction has always been the way in which we have progressed in terms of the disturbance of new entrepreneurs coming up with new ideas, and that you had a movement, a structural shock into your economic system leading you to a higher level of welfare. You could also have exactly the opposite, what I've called here destructive creation. And destructive creation is basically exactly the same phenomenon, but it's not that, as I've put it here, society's dynamics leading to higher levels of economic development and welfare, destroying a few incumbents to the benefit of many newcomers. Now you have exactly the opposite. You have a few newcomers benefiting at the expense of many, leading you to a lower level of development. And there is no reason why this could not exist, and I'll try to elaborate very briefly what and why this is very much associated, again, with these information and communication technologies and the networks. In my view, a common feature of this kind of destructive creation is indeed short-termism, easy free-rider nature, and dependency on networks, whereby the regulatory framework governing the network provides the major source for innovation. And we don't realize sufficiently how in these networks, linked with information technologies, the regulatory framework is basically the framework in which you operate. Now, it's in the behavior of every human to try to figure out strategic ways to circumvent such regulations. And the creative mind is creative. And it will try continuously to come up with ways in which the existing regulatory framework can be circumvented in law, in principle, by coming up with new innovations. And you have many of these, etc. I list here the positive features of the ICT, the tremendous increase in the versions of particular products, the fact that we can now travel very cheap, that all kind of versioning, thanks to information and technologies, in terms of the access to empty seats in a plane, empty rooms in a hotel. There is a continuous, it's as if we, along the demand curve, we can provide a difference in the versioning of all these products, services, by increasing in a dramatic way the demand and the consumption of these goods. But of course, regulation-driven innovation has also exactly the opposite. That is that in these networks, one will continuously attempt to try to link the core nodes in the network and to exploit the cherries, so to say, in the network framework. And exploiting those is, of course, leads you that many of the features of the internal subsidy combinations which exist in such networks, that those kind of transparency leads you to new markets emerging, by which basically the universal service of many of these networks is coming under pressure. And so what you get is basically that, as I put it here, in network services, it has increasingly become expensive to be poor. Because the previous universal service guaranteed a certain quality, it guaranteed a certain access to the network. Think of living in a peripheral area in terms of public transport, think of many other features of health networks, education networks. You have, basically large parts of our societies, when we integrate services, are dependent on these networks, are network-based. And so what you get is basically that this is a battle between the network regulator, who has to follow up with respect to the continuous innovation in the network, with areas being picked out for market opportunities of this nature of what I call destructive creation type, and the regulator, which has to try to figure out how we can survive. I give you 3 cases. The first is our ecological and sustainable innovation-led consumer growth paths. I can elaborate, I won't have the time. I refer you here to Calvano's model, which puts this in a very neat way in terms of how this leads you to total unsustainability. The second is, of course, financial innovations. And again, each of these financial innovations as they were introduced, again, thanks to the ICT network, whether you talk about credit default swaps or you talk about many other new products, have basically spread out the risks across the globe in terms of these products. And of course, the last, not surprisingly, coming from Maastricht, is of course the euro as an institutional innovation with a dramatic negative welfare implication, and yet an innovation as such at the moment when it was introduced. All these, in my view, are creative destructive times. I have not much time to elaborate on this given the time and the need for some questioning, and I can answer those in terms of question. But let me just highlight the one from Emilio Calvano, which is a very neat one, because it is very closely linked to new growth theory. It basically illustrates that it will be in the interest of innovative firms to at each time reg the value of the old versions of their products, and that is a much easier and quicker and profitable way to restore profits than actually to continue in a competitive framework in terms of trying to become more efficient in producing existing products. So you have a kind of internal continuous pressure to try to increase the demand for new versions of your products. In the extreme case, this can lead to planned obsolescence. And we have a couple of legal cases. I refer to you here back into the legal case brought against Apple in 2003 with respect to the planned obsolescence of the battery life of the batteries of the iPod. So you have really in the interest, simply in the pure profit-driving incentive of firms, there will be a line by which firms will be continuously in need to try to produce new products. Paul David, a good friend also of mine and of many of you here, called this the innovation fetish Imelda Marco syndrome. And I think this is a very nice one, because he says, in memory of a famous instance of the uncontrollable obsessive accumulation of more and more pairs of women's shoes. So, no problem, of course, because if this is the dynamics of your society, why this is a major dynamic problem is, of course, that this leads you in the innovation line towards focusing continuously on the tip of your income pyramid. And that in terms of the dynamics of your growth, of your consumer-led growth, it gives you basically that the middle classes are basically disappearing in your models. And what you get is, and as I put it here, you are in search of the Keynesian T model, the 4T model, to regenerate a much more average growth across the board. So where is the innovation? And this is where I come to Callisto's point of view. Where is the innovation for the middle income levels, for the youngsters, for the elderly? Where is the innovation at the low income level, etc., etc.? The implications of all this is that you will never get sustainability with this kind of consumer-led tip of the income pyramid innovation growth, because you continuously generate new products which do not actually do anything else but replace you wreck the stock of existing capital and push you in a continuously further consumption. I leave the rest, I can elaborate on this more, I leave the rest of the examples I've given here to the discussion, but it's very clear once we deal with financial innovation or with the euro, and you only have to refer to the statement here of Alan Greenspan at the time to see how clearly the vision was that this financial innovation, as he put it, these increasingly complex financial instruments have contributed to the development of a far more flexible, efficient, and hence resilient financial system than the one that existed just a quarter century ago. So innovation was viewed really as an addition, a positive feature. The reality, of course, looking back at it today, is that this was, of course, typically examples of destructive creative innovation. Thank you.